All right. Hello, everybody. This is Tripp, and I'm here with Phil. Say hi, Phil.
Hey, guys. Greetings. Hi.
And we're going to process some doctrines. This is going to be exciting. One, because this will be the best Process Your Doctrines webinar of all time. I have it on good authority that there's never been an interactive Processing Your Doctrines webinar on this planet, at least, and in this instantiation of the cosmos. If, I don't know, Whitehead thought there might have been multiple cosmological adventures. So maybe it's happened before, but not probably multiverse style, because he wouldn't have been as comfortable with that. There would have to be unique, particular cosmological endeavors. But we may get to that. I don't know. But today we're going to process doctrines. You voted on them. We're going to talk about God, theology, Christology, some Jesus, and then ecclesiology, the church. Nathan is very disappointed we didn't have anthropology. Tell him, Nathan. Nathan's very disappointed the anthropology didn't win, so we might have to process that later. So everyone, this is Phil and I hang out regularly on the internet as part of the Homebrewed community group. If you're interested in joining and having fun with us as we read books and talk about it, you can go to homebrewedcommunity.com. You can see about it. Like we read Moltmann, we read Whitehead, we read Sabrina, we read Augustine, Plato. And the ending this season is Elizabeth Johnson. And conveniently, Phil, Elizabeth Johnson's going to join us one of the times to talk about her book, which I figured we'll do after we've said what she really means. I haven't worked at the exact dates, but I figured we should describe what she really means. Yeah. And then she could set us both straight collectively. She's like,
Tripp, either way works, because if she has to come on for the first one, we let her talk, and a month later we tell everyone what she should have said, what she needs.
Yeah. So anyway, that's gonna be a lot of fun, and there's a Facebook group where we've been pitching ideas of what we're gonna do next year. So you can get on there if you're not and you're part of the community, and give some input. So what we're going to do today is Phil and I each came up with thesis statements processing the doctrine. We'll take turns giving our thesis statement in tweetable form. It will be tweeted. And then we'll argue about them or talk about them or unpack them or whatnots. We'll do the doctrines. And then as that's happening, if you post your own thesis statement with the hashtag process this, then Phil and I will discuss that hashtag process this thesis statement. And who knows what we'll end up saying. I promise he won't enjoy giving yours as hard a time as he'll enjoy giving mine. And then after that, or you can give us a theological conclusion for which we will come up with the process question that your conclusion is the answer, Jeopardy style. Both of those are just completely confusing. You can just ask questions, but we'll give preferential option to people that participate in playing theological games on this said first Processing Your Doctrine webinar for this cosmological instantiation of the God creativity world and eternal form experience. So, Phil, how are you? What do you think is about to happen?
This has never happened before. The only trouble with that compliment is it follows automatically from Whitehead, because every moment is absolutely new. So I wasn't bursting with pride when you said that.
Well, that is 5 process points for Phil. If you don't know Philip Clayton, he is a professor at Claremont School of Theology, and which is in California on the side of the mountains and the heat. And he's knows lots of things about theology, philosophy, religion, and science, and all sorts of things in between. So before we jump in, though, I was told, Monica Coleman told me that I'm not a good enough process person. My Christology is too high. I'm more process friendly. So you have a chair with a lineage, high quality process lineage. So why don't you tell us the shoulders you're on and some of the basic ideas or pushbacks or concerns you have as a constructive Christian theologian wrestling with process philosophy?
Well, we have to be really careful, because although Monica A. Coleman says that you're process friendly, she says that I'm a process heretic. So I don't know if that's higher or lower on the scale, since Whiteheadians aren't supposed to be too worried about heresy.
I don't know. I don't
know. I think you called me process fluid the other day. Not quite sure what to make with that one. No, there is a lineage. Actually, I spent 6 hours today in John Cobb's apartment. Yeah, thank you, Dan. And he wants us to renew the great tradition of process thought and science. And so John Cobb says, well, we did these amazing things, but with this humility. And he says, so looking at everyone else in the room, you've got to do twice as good for the next 10 years. Process is as much in the air here as unbreathable smog is. It's a process center school. So if I have the Ingram chair, everyone reminds me that Margie Suhaki held the chair before I did, and that John Cobb held it at the beginning, which means that it's been a downhill spiral ever since. And then a generation ago, David Griffin and Cobb and Marjorie were the center of the process world. My first year here was David Griffin's last year. So he said, all right, Phil, we're going out for wine every Wednesday after our evening classes. And I'll tell you what it really means. And here's what you have to do for the next 25 years. He's a real humble guy like that. And so I try to come along. But after the second or third glass of beer, I could say, David, maybe that's not completely right. And if his eyes were glazed over enough, then I could sometimes win an argument. So with that in mind, as Tripp's eyes glaze over, I'm hoping that I can convince y'all that these three thesis statements are both Christian and at least heretically processed.
All right, Phil. So we're going to do God first, or theology. So why don't you tell us your first thesis statement on God?
Right, as Nathaniel sent it out? All right, it's out there. Each one's exactly 140 characters, right? So we can't mess around when it's the doctrine of God. 139 just won't go. So here's my tweetable statement. God, spirit of the universe, yet also transcendent, guides us and all things at every instant, deeply impacted by all, because that's what love means, or that's what love requires. What's beautiful is you can start with classical Christian language. You don't have to stumble over your tongue. God, no problem in process theology, right at the center of the way that Whitehead and Hartshorne put it forward. Spirit of the universe, that's the immanence side, the God who's always present, who's never deus absconditus, the God who absconds from the world. There's no shyness about God's presence to everything, whereas Orthodoxy worried a little bit about that. God's presence to sin, God's presence to evil, God's presence to fallenness can never sully the divine character, the antecedent nature of God. It's present to all things, yet also transcendent. So there's no way in which this just becomes pantheism, despite what Roger Olson thinks and a couple of our other friends. The God remains always more than the total experience of the world. Put those two clauses together, spirit of the universe, yet also transcendent, is the definition of panentheism. Another way to say it is God is present to all things, the world is within God, yet God is also more than the world at every moment. From that then guides us in all things at every instant. There's never coercion. God is never forcing us to do something, which I think is not a picture of the God that we'd want to affirm, the God of Jesus Christ. Not only us, but it's an ecological position, so all things are within the purview of God's care, concern, and grace at every instant, because process is a philosophy of instant after instant. It's a present tense philosophy and theology. And then finally, God deeply impacted by all. There's no experience in the world that doesn't become an experience of God, and no experience that God doesn't respond to out of the divine character of love, care, and compassion, but experiencing it as we do, as every living being does. Why should God be deeply impacted rather than being impassible, transcendent, distant from the world? Because that's what love requires. If you told a parent or a partner or a child that you heard what they said, but it didn't really impact you at all, that would show the absence of love. God is the supremely loving one, or as Margie Suhaki says, the completely related one, the supremely related one, then God's the one who responds with the deepest compassion to every moment of experience of every created being. 140 characters.
All right, so the idea we had is that we would give the thesis statement, and then we would take turns asking each other questions. I'm thinking we only get to ask the other one 2 questions.
You got it.
But not like normal Tripp on the podcast questions that are 40 sentence statements with a question mark implied at the end. So the first question, the first question is that this process vision of panentheism, how do you see it distinguished from at least 2 other forms of Christian panentheism, be it, you can pick whoever you want, like Moltmann or the open theist or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Actually, let's start with Moltmann because you mentioned it. Moltmann comes so close to it. He has this book in God in Creation, the idea of Tzimtzum, or God withdrawing, in order to make the creation take place within the being of God. He takes that from Kabbalah, from the medieval Jewish mysticism. That's the world within God, but kind of in an attenuated sense, because there's this little chamber or wound or something where he keeps the world sort of safely walled in. Then when he gets to the crucified God, and the question is, he's just moving up so close. It's about page 232 or something in the chapter on the crucified God. He's moving up so close to this teaching that God could be fully immersed in the experience of the world, experiencing what Jesus is experiencing fully without reservation or distanciation. And then he, as we talked about in the podcast a couple months ago, he can't go there. He pulls back a little bit. Even more disappointing is John Polkinghorn, who, as a famous theologian working on science and religion, could have understood God's permeating quantum physics and biology and consciousness and so forth, but then he would only use the term eschatological panentheism, that at the final point, God shall be all in all, and we are integrated into the life of God. Why wait? Why should the God of Jesus Christ defer for whoever knows how many thousands or millions or billions of years to be in that relationship which Jesus experienced and promised to us as well?
All right, second question is, how does your understanding of the process God-world relationship impact your own piety?
That's a great question. In worship, with a congregation, I expect that I believe that God is permeating every individual and this space, and not pulling back from places where there's sin or separation from God or reservation, that those shortfalls on our part don't mean that God's Spirit can't be completely present. In nature, I don't need to think, as I once thought as a young evangelical, that God's only present in buildings or where Bibles are opened, but I can actually experience that God is completely present in that moment in the forest or on the beach or wherever it is. In relationships, I can believe and experience that I see the face of God in that other one. As the Quakers say, there is that of God in each one. I don't need to say, well, that's only metaphorical. I can believe that it's just completely true. And in private being with God, I can say I'm not seeking a transcendent absent being, but I'm existing in the pervasive presence of the divine.
All right. Well, my God tweet, which is not utilizing all 140 characters to its fullness, is God is spiritual and religious, hashtag hypertheist, hashtag process this. So recently, we just finished reading Religion in the Making in the Epic Reads group. And I basically picked this because this was the topic I wanted to talk to Phil about the most. And now I'm about to say it, so we get to talk about it. So I decided that he was a bit confused because he kept using religion in two different ways through the book. So I thought I would help him out and make him postmodern and trendy by differentiating the way he understands spirituality and religion. He tells the story of the evolution of religion, where it emerges with these rituals that then give us the ability to have emotional, social interaction around things other than meeting our needs. And then it comes up to these notions of belief and rationality. And you have these stages of religious development that he highlights the way in which you understand your value commitment to the world around you. And it begins like with your tribal identity, and then the social identity, because you start to include others. And then you get to the world. Which he points out is beautifully captured in the teachings of Jesus. Like, when you say love your enemy, then you've kind of said there is no one on the outside. And that this beautiful picture of religion are these stages of development, and that you're leaving something behind when you leave behind the traditions, stories, rituals, practices, and traditions that help people move up this conveyor belt of values that God has been investing and bringing about through the history of the God-world relationship. And that's being religious. But being spiritual is something else. And that's not so many the stages of religious development, but the state in which you're related to the universe, creativity. There's a lot of processy ways of thinking about it. But he talks about this sense of religion being solitariness, in which you've created this state of spiritual existence where you've distanced yourself from what's right around you, be it who your neighbor thinks you are, the role that you're being given in your job, or what your parents say about you that's running in your head all the time, or what they say, or I have to do this, or I have to get this, or I have to be this. You distance yourself from all the immediate claims that are before you so that you're able to invest yourself spiritually and deeply for the common good, the well-being of all. And that spirituality is cultivating this process of differentiation from what's grasping your consciousness right in front, so that you can be spiritually invested in whatever your vocation, your family, political, religious obligations are. And that this vision of God as being spiritual and religious, to me, is a beautiful, powerful picture of what God's been up to in all the religious traditions across the world, and a way for us to think forward, not as battling out different versions of God or different versions of religion, but a way to encounter across religious and spiritual diversity beautiful pockets of insights and wisdoms that are, and Whitehead uses a picture in Process and Reality of canals that get brought in as things are fruitfully happen over and over, this canaling of the spirit, or the impressing of God on each moment can get deeper and deeper with this faithful response. It's the image in Religion in the Making. So one of the coolest parts for me about a process doctrine of God is you have the ability to see this historical ongoing relationship with God in living communities where you have the stages of religious development emerge. They become more inclusive and growing. And you have this ever-present availability that's to be cultivated contemplatively of our relationship to ourself, creating this type of sense of solitariness that creates the conditions for greater world loyalty. All right, Phil, there you go.
Woo! Anyone who ends with greater world loyalty is either brilliant or incomprehensible. All right. My questions are so concise and to the point that we're going to give me 3. I may roll 2 together. So you're process friendly. In fact, very friendly, it's sounding to me. So process really bothers a lot of Orthodox people, like, if I can mention a random name, Roger Olson, because it argues that God and the world are fully symmetrical. That, just, it says in the end of Process and Reality, 348, just as the world is such and such, so also is God. and it's completely symmetrical. And when we read God as spiritual and religious, we wonder, are you going to pull back from that core thesis of Whitehead and argue for the primacy of God? Or are you going to go with Whitehead on that fully symmetrical relationship between those two?
I think I have no interest in like having a necessary symmetry, but that's probably because I'm not feeling the need to be a fundamentalist about Whitehead. I'm not on Team Gryffindor. I'm more of a Hufflepuff process type. Not involved in lots of the big fights. You're always there at the party. Your team's not that good at Quidditch, but you take it seriously. But I'd also say that when you make a move that a number of different process people have post Whitehead, where you see the role of the forms functioning much more like the mind of God than something autonomous from God, like Joseph Bracken does stuff like that, or when you recognize the parallelism that Suhaki develops, that out of the end of process and reality, with the physical pole going first and then the mental pole and then the flip side for the world. I think that there is a preferential option for God's call, lure, and possibility, and that the history of God with all creation gives God a greater sense of knowledge, presence, and awareness and investment in it than any part of the world on its own. The interesting thing I find when people get uncomfortable with the symmetry passage is it's usually like they forget that then like 2 paragraphs later, the symmetry is described poetically as the Lord's Prayer, that in every moment, like the kingdom of God comes to earth and it seeks to be embodied, and then it opens up, then it does it again. Like the religious description of that for Whitehead was one that when it was made poetic was that every event is the Lord's Prayer. So I don't see the symmetries as big a threat as some people do. But I have a high confidence in the infinite love of God being luringly efficient eschatologically, so I don't lose as much sleep as others.
Well, we'll let the people in the chat decide whether you should lose more sleep. Is the process God first interreligious and then Christian, or first Christian and then somehow by implication interreligious?
Well, the process God or Tripp? I mean, like, so for me, I found process persuasive first because it insists that to understand the God-world relationship, the most accurate image of this ever-present, invisible, participating God is the teachings, ministry, and death of Jesus. And not a death among other deaths, but one that insists about hope and possibility beyond death. So whether Whitehead is one of the most amazing Western philosophies that are thoroughly Judeo-Christian, but significantly better than the being-centric Aristotelian style, that does have this beautiful possibility of east-west dialogue across creativity and God and multiple ultimates and all that kind of stuff. There are tons of ways to connect it. But like when Whitehead wants to drop poetry bombs on who God is, they're thoroughly Christocentric. So, is Hegel's God necessarily Christian? Maybe. But I actually think Whitehead thinks that Christianity is cooler than Hegel. And the image of God, as communicated in Whitehead, does assume that that religion is never a logic of the one; it's always a many in a one type of thing. So this is the other thing I wanted to ask you during it. Do you think Whitehead's image of the transformations of religion is similar to like Schleiermacher's at the end of the speeches on religion, where he describes part of the triumph of Christianity is moving culture and humanity to a different place and opening up whole new possibilities. And that when you get territorial about where you've already been, then you're killing religion. And that's a bigger danger than, I don't know, heresy or, I don't know, whatever other things you can lose sleep about.
Okay, so that's a great topic to talk about. It leads to my third and final question. So let me ask that first and then see where you go. You just kind of, if I can be gentle here, you kind of wimped out on the symmetries question, because those things look really literal, and you said, hey, but guys, it's no problem because 2 paragraphs later he starts using poetry. So maybe I'm just going to view this language as poetry, which actually raises a great question. Would Whitehead actually be more useful to us if we took the whole thing as poetic, suggestive, literary, narrative, but not as really a framework philosophy for Christian theology? How deeply do you want to go that route that you just pointed us toward, the poetic Whitehead?
Well, I mean, that's the poetic conclusion of a book that begins explaining speculative metaphysics, and I think you need to have the awareness of both. Speculative metaphysics for Whitehead is this sense where, we know all constructions are just that, constructions, so keep learning and keep figuring out how to do a better job. The question, and he says at the beginning of the book of Religion of the Making, the question of who is God and how is God related to the world is the ultimate religious and scientific and philosophical question. So I don't think you can opt out and say, well, just doing poetry. But he does insist that faithfulness to the truth means constructions have a beginning, an ending, an assessment, and then you do it again. And the play at the truth is a better way of showing your fidelity to it than defending some final complete construct. So I would just want to point that out. If you said it theologically, you could say something like, all good philosophical theologians lapse into simple doxology. They just don't know when they do it. Right? Like, there are parts where if we're sitting there and there are places you and Laurent Schultz agreed. And at that point, you're like, okay, we got 99% here in the room still going that are informed. But then at some point, you're disagreeing, and you're like, yeah, but here's why. And it's like, no, here's why. Then at some point, you're like, in the image of the invisible God is a homeless dead Jew. And there's a lot of people not in that room, but it doesn't mean that that you are, as the theologian, aren't trying to make that claim, trying to articulate it, and all that kind of thing. But the conditions for affirming it are very different than the conditions for explaining. We have a question coming up around block time. They're just different. And you can't, there's nothing wrong with that. And so when in part 5 of Process and Reality, you get the symmetries, and then you get that poetry, this is the first time in past 4 sentences where you get the introduction of the consequent nature of God. Before, it's all primordial nature type talk, or not the God who's always being changing and being twisted and moved and stuff by the world. Before, it's like God is the giver of possibility out of these kind of fixed-ish, zesty style, adventure-inspiring beauty, truth, and goodness forms. But to me, I think those symmetries are a way of trying to fix or connected to the emergence of the notion of the consequent nature of God. But I don't think that's somehow fixed for us as Christians. We all lapse into doxology, but we don't know where, and that's totally cool.
So you've got Whitehead's metaphysics sort of rising out of this metaphysical quest, getting the categories right, doing the whole system, and then lapsing back down to the complexity of experience, admitting it fell short, and you do the loop over again. Let me do a Pete Rollins here. Is that really what we want to say? Or shouldn't we say at the very outset that God is a word, a shorthand, a word in quotations that expresses, Roland Faber might say, the poetry of the world. God is the poet of the world. And that if we take the whole thing as an expression of beauty, an expression of interconnectedness, but we avoid any sense of some thick, grid-like metaphysics, that it becomes a lot more useful to biblical texts and life than the framework you just offered us. So go back to your Schleiermacher idea. 1799 edition of the speeches, but right in the very beginning, so lecture 1 or lecture 2, imagine that we read Whitehead the way that Schleiermacher describes the presence of the Spirit so fully and imminently in the world. It's like the dew on the flower, like the blush on the young maiden's cheek. It is as if we in the finite world are herausgeschnitten, as if we're sliced or cut out of this all-encompassing divine spirit. Now, if we could read Whitehead, who sometimes writes poetically, with a sort of license that Schleiermacher gives, we'd have fewer conflicts, we'd have a richer and more beautiful commentary here, and fewer conflicts. What do you think?
I tend to pick the contrarian side of most questions.
We've noticed.
And that's why the last hashtag was hypertheist. Now, I've hung out at lots of churches and stuff, and only like 2 people in any church are interested in hypotheism, which if you were playing Pete and our post-structuralist friends, tends to be my response to it. Not that I can't understand it. I can even think of it as a plausible thing next door that's interesting. Not as interesting as football and Greenpeace on Sunday mornings, but nonetheless. But I also think that part of the challenge for philosophical theologians is to give an account of God and the world. And if you're a Christian philosophical theologian, it's to give account of God and the world and God's self-testimony in the person of Jesus. I don't know why I should just switch the job description of a Christian theologian to match concerns about language from people that are concerned about any form of language that says anything after you finish getting done saying the way the words were constructed and lined up. Like, to me, the pushback of theology as in that way, it's like taking a balloon animal and then having a pin and just deflating all the balloons so it has 0 shape, and they're still hooked together and stuff, and they're like, hey, look, it's a giraffe. And you're like, and I have not had the experience as a minister where that is what people thought you said when you said God. So the other half of it for me is, I'm an ordained minister. Like, I feel there's a certain duplicitousness when you take the poetry of a tradition and then use it against itself and meaning things no one has really ever meant. And so the conversations around process, metaphysics, and God and stuff, for me, are always secondary to my identity as a Christian theologian and minister. They're used to that end. But, I tend to think of it kind of like Augustine talking about Platonism. Hey, if it's really cool and you're on the way out of Egypt, grab the gold. You can melt it down and do some other stuff with it. And there's the taking of deflationary philosophy back to a community that would never understand it, not go along with it, and wouldn't be there seems a bit disingenuous.
So, Chip, it's a little bit of a straw man of what you're attacking. Now, I know I'm not going to convert you to post-structuralism, since far less post-structuralist fluid friends of ours have tried, and anyone who's listened to more than 5 minutes of a homebrewed show knows that you're the fixed rock who will never budge on this question. But this is a natural way to read Whitehead and a natural way to talk about our topic, which is Christian theology and process. What if, instead of launching with this kind of dry metaphysic, which has driven so many good conscienced people away from process over the years, what if we began with process as a kind of coloring, a kind of framework for understanding Christianity and Christian thought, because in some ways it's more distant. What if it helped us understand the scriptural focus on the love of God, the responsiveness of God, the closeness of God, the presence of God through the Spirit, and so forth. And Whitehead sort of gave a shimmer or a frame, not a framework, that's too intellectual, a first emotional connection to that. In fact, in parentheses, maybe every philosophical theology should begin by admitting that it colors Christian understanding in certain ways. It sets a kind of aura around it. And then with Whitehead having served that function, let's go into the dry stuff. Let's say, so what would be the best theory of categories for Christianity? What would be the best understanding of the God-world relationship and so forth? Wouldn't that be a much more approachable way to approach Whitehead and this podcast?
Well, I think that the best way of teaching it, unless you're in like a graduate school classroom where you're just supposed to learn it, is at least as a minister, it was always in sermons. It's real easy to just exegete text that way and interpret it. The coolest part about process, though, is that if you're able to think about it metaphysically, then you're able to see all the metaphysical assumptions that culturally we insert into a text that are non-relational. They have like the scientific reductionism, materialism, dualism, and all these type of metaphysical conclusions most of our congregants all believe, don't know they believe, and are destructive to a living and life-giving understanding of God. And so with a process, when you're able to give new life to the text, which, because I have a rather strong confidence that most Christians' piety resonates with process, if you take out concrescence and luring and all that kind of stuff, that type of exegesis makes the text alive, because the experience of God in piety and worship and living, contemplative practice and stuff resonates with the way you're exegeting it, without those crappy metaphysical things. And
awesome. Now, that's exactly what I hoped you were going to say. So I'm going to stop you there, because finally you said the right thing.
Oh, that's good.
We should move on to the next doctrine.
All right. So Christology. So I'll go first this time, Phil, so that you can set me straight when you get done. All right. So my Christology tweet is Jesus Christ, hashtag fruit of the vine of David, hashtag image of the invisible God, hashtag freaking awesome, hashtag process this. So I think that process philosophy, especially if you have a less than fundamentalist relationship to it, gives some rather amazing ways of understanding a God-world relationship in which our Christological commitments and things in the tradition make quite a bit more sense. So the first hashtag, the fruit of the vine of David, is out of the Didache, which is an early church training manual, older than 2/3 of the New Testament kind of thing. And the description of fruit of the vine of David captures to me that the incarnation is not this divine invasion where God finally shows up in the world, but that Jesus, the fruit of the vine of David, is the product of God's ongoing relationship with the people of Israel, the prophets, the exiles, the return, slavery, liberation, the ritualizing of that story of the God-Israel relationship, the covenantal faithfulness, unfaithfulness, redemption, and that entire narrative brings about the sacred canopy, the stories and rituals in which Jesus, with a mom who sings rather socialist propaganda versions of Isaiah-themed songs to him as a small child, it gets up and is fully faithful to the lure of God, such that this is the fruit of the vine of David. What God had been bringing about, brought through full cooperation of this one who, if you're process nerdy for a moment, on the side of John Cobb, whose eye coheres with the divine eye, making the primordial nature of God present in the world in a unique and particular way, and such that you could say this life, this person, this is the image of the invisible God, made flesh, made sarx, and that dynamism is a way of affirming these two different traditions you see in early church testimonies to Christology, the Logos Christology and the Spirit Christology, where you have a non-interventionist understanding of the incarnation, logos style, and you have the a rupturous arrival of the fully faithful one, empowered by the Spirit with the inheritance, the prophetic mantle of Mama and Amos on their back. So that to me is why I love process for Christological purposes, and why it's freaking awesome, because you got to have a critical and faithful Christology today that engages all sorts of things that are in my book. But you also need to have one where the experience of God is mediated by Jesus throughout the history of the church with a multiplicity of affirmations. Is one in which in all those testimonies we come to know ourselves as known and loved by God completely, in that way in which we discovered it is through a homeless dead Jew who is the fruit of the vine of David, image of the invisible God. That is freaking awesome. So that's the third hashtag for Christology processized. You're on mute, Phil.
That's a mouthful. The things I'm saying really need to be muted. I like your rapturous arrival, but I wonder if it should be your rupturous arrival, but maybe it should be rapturous arrival. Never mind. First question: if process works for Jesus in the way that you just said, and it's a beautiful answer. I think there's a lot of power in that. Does process also work for the Old Testament?
Yes.
Try that.
Actually, without the entire Whitehead in Religion of the Making actually gives the best reason why we should not be Marcionites, like Christians that are like, oh, we got the loving God in the New Testament, let's not have the Old. He points out that the history of Israel and the early church is this ongoing wrestling with our understanding of ourselves before God, our understanding of God, and that you see in it the development of the tradition in which we move from this tribal consciousness, henotheism, multiple deities, our tribal deity, into this social consciousness to a more cosmic one, universal one that emerges later in the tradition. And that in it, the passion of God is constantly erupting on the outside of any new instantiated tradition, which connects to where we end up with ecclesiology. But that throughout the Hebrew scriptures, there's a battle over the image of God, the power of God, and the triumph of God and what it looks like. And consistently through the tradition, where you think you have God and it's in a temple and then it's not. You think you have God and it's in a king and then it's not. You think you have God on your priestly agenda and prophet selected by the man and it's not. That tension and dynamic is the only place in which it emerges that there is a God who knows your name, knows your face, loves for you, and takes a stand with the poor, the oppressed, the alienated, and the outcast. It's only in the tradition of the one who remains faithful despite our ideologies and our idolatries that creates the context for the fruit of the vine of David. And so Jesus' Jewishness and his inheritance is an essential and not a tertiary part of his identity. And without the Hebrew scriptures, then we alienate ourselves as Christians to our own history and inheritance with the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and company. So,
Last question. That's a good answer. Last question. Tripp, it looks like Professor Monica A. Coleman is right. That is, it looks like any serious process theology can't really affirm the uniqueness of Jesus, except, of course, in the trivial sense that every moment and every person is unique. True?
No, that's not what I was saying.
I know it wasn't what you were saying, but
okay.
All the audience are begging me to ask this question.
So if I was a fundamentalist about Whitehead, then I might say something like that. But here's recently where I think the problem emerged in liberal Christian theology, and I'm trying to write chapter 4 of my dissertation, which is complaining about this process style. So we will know what you and Monica think about it in the near future. But
By whether people start calling you Dr. Fuller or not.
Yeah, they're like, where did that go? And you're like, who did it, Monica or Phil? Or Dr. Coleman or Phil, because I got to wait till I'm done to go back to Monica. The liberal Logos Christology, when you were working with rather poor metaphysics and a whole bunch of things, took Logos Christology and then turned it into it localized the Logos as native to anthropology, that it's constitutive of being human, that Jesus just had his like Logos light on brighter. And the odd part of this, for me, and there are plenty of liberal theologians that did something similar. Roger Haight did it in contemporary thought. And why I don't think process people need to do that is because there is no generic anthropology. Jesus had a vocation, namely the Messiah. He had a tradition. He wasn't some generic human. He was a homeless Jewish prophet that was, mama was Mary, daddy's Joseph over here. He rejects his vocation in the temptations to like be the kindly benevolent Caesar if you just bow the knee, or turning rocks into bread, or surfing off the top of the temple. How is Jesus Messiah? Namely by calling the excluded and outcast to be a part of the community. When he leaves the desert, the temptations, he calls a community. This is one who is Messiah by being in community and fulfilling in that his vocation. So that means that you don't have to like make some generic incarnation of be this like constant abstract anthropological possibility, as if that possibility is generic. No, everyone has a unique story and possibilities before us. And oddly enough, we're rather confident that regardless of how you respond at any moment, God's still in the business of making beautiful the next. So it's the essentializing of anthropology, trying to take the Logos and essentialize it in human beings is the problem. And I don't think process has to do that. That's why you get these notions at the Religion of the Making, where God is either greater impressed or more faint after the response of each moment, or that this image of the divine canal being carved out as the intensity of the divine waters rush over each moment. To me, this means that you can say that Jesus has a unique and particular identity. I'd also say that John Cobbs basically says he does too in his Christology, and the anyway, we don't have to keep going. That would be a long conversation. But because Don Rosato has a question that fits so well here that I have to read it. But you're going to have to be brief so we can move on to the more important answer to this question. Can the process Christians say that God's taking in the experience of the other world religions before the birth of Jesus, that contributed to the life of Jesus through, we'll have to say, through the divine lure, the presence of God to every one of Jesus' concrescences? If you say yes, then Jesus is not only the fruit of the vine of David, but the fruit of the vine of God's lure to all peoples before Jesus. Awesome question. Mm-hmm. So I would say, I think both and. One is that what we prehend in each moment is all that came before. What we're conscious of is a completely different thing altogether. And also, what is available to us symbolically and things like that to the human responding varies across culture. Why I like the image of the fruit of the vine of David for Jesus is that the God-Israel relationship functions so often at the level of sacred canopy in relationship to the many throughout, but it's not every many. The uniqueness of Israel is that God had this subversive paradigm, namely the covenant, right? Post-Babel, God's like, I've tried to relate to everyone. We saw how that worked. I'm investing in Abraham and Sarah. Now, repeatedly, the prophets point out God took the very same tact towards other cultures and people. Just check like Moses' father-in-law. Or, I mean, there's tons of examples throughout. So, yes, God has that relationship with others. But I would say that the more beautiful part to me isn't that Jesus is the fruit of all of those things, but to say that there is a cornucopia of fruit and spiritual wisdom that we have today that's available to us, and that you aren't being faithful to Jesus by just eating grapes. You should eat some cantaloupe, and it's not a bad thing. And this is one of the ways I really have appreciated John describing the difference between salvation and enlightenment. So, and maybe Phil, you could say a bit about that question and that connection, because I think that is a real freeing thing, where you still have this very particular tradition and location in the Judeo-Christian history, and as a person encountering God with Jesus, and the wisdom and practices of the East become a completely different tool, as opposed to this, let's mash them together and say we're all hanging out together on the weekends equally. You muted yourself, Phil.
So let me go ahead and give my tweet first while Nathaniel's sending it, and then I can answer what you just said as I go. So here it is. Experiencing as we do, Jesus expresses the responsive pull of God. Intimate divine presence, infinitely near, acting in and through us without coercion. That took me like 12 minutes to get that into 140 characters. Experiencing as we do, Jesus expresses the responsive pull of God. Intimate divine presence, infinitely near, acting in and through us without coercion. So many people got that wrong in the history of philosophical theology. And immediately after Jesus and the birth of the church, you've got the early patristics and then the high patristic and high scholastic framework, which makes God separate from the world, which begins with this separation of substances so that God can come be present too, but can't interpenetrate, can't do the real dance of perichoresis, the dance in, with, and through. And that those fluid New Testament notions, the notion that we live in whom we live and move and have our being, the notion of in Christ that gets repeated almost 100 times in the New Testament, permeating, living within, vivified by the presence of Christ. Those rich concepts that can't be domesticated or colonized in any way start being shoved to the side because of some other philosophical framework. You know, like dropping ice cubes on your back in a 90-degree day. Not the patristics, not the high scholastic, not the early modern philosophers like Descartes with his separate substances, not the Enlightenment, like you mentioned before, which leads to this focus on reason as the dominant principle, shoving emotions aside. On the other hand, not Schleiermacher, who limited to experience and can only talk about the forms of God consciousness without a framework more metaphysical, more clear, more guiding. And finally, not Hegel. The Whitehead's view would never have an unfolding necessity, a process, of course, but one that works by a sort of necessity of dialectical unfolding. None of those does justice to that original gospel, to that story of Jesus, in the same way as the sense of a God who, even metaphysically, experiences as we do, takes in data, in this case perfectly, responds to it, forms the perfect concrescence, and then sends that out as a lure to us in the next moment. Just as we then take the input of God and all the other inputs, at each moment formulate our response, and then respond, that becomes available to the rest of the world. Intimate divine presence, intimate because we are in fundamental ways similar. Infinitely near to us because nothing can separate us from that ongoing involvement in a process Christology. And here's the last thing I want to say. Whitehead's philosophy, understood most deeply, needed to be incarnational. The missing piece was this sort of abstract picture of the forming a concrescence, mental and physical prehensions, objective immortality, cycling. Wasn't complete unless it had an expression in the very bone and marrow of who we are. Unless God not only took on the objective immortality, that is a record, as it were, of the experiences that the concrescents had kept in the divine memory. God actually had to experience it to the bone. And that is what is offered by the New Testament doctrine of incarnation. So for me, a flowing together of this, for me, beautiful, uniquely New Testament notion, unparalleled in any other world tradition, on the one hand, and then the Whiteheadian notion of the flow of experience, the flow of history, the flowing movement between humans and God, between all living things and God. Those two doctrines are so beautifully wed. That, for me, would be at the heart of a process Christology.
So, how was the divine life shaped, changed, and reconfigured after Christ? Historical life, at least.
To understand the reshaping of God's life over history after Christ's death and resurrection, we have to understand how the divine life was transformed by the incarnation. So the process thinker might worry, all right, so I've got this interaction of God and world from the very beginning. And for the process thinker, the orthodox one, that's been eternally. As long as there was God, there was a world that God was interacting with, and the divine experience was being made more rich. In a Christian process theology, however long that process went on, at the moment that God experienced the interaction with God and body and others from the standpoint of incarnation, God was present to the world in a different way. So that the Spirit of God, and you can think that in Whiteheadian terms, after Jesus' death should be understood like the high priestly prayer of John 14-17. I'm no longer here, but I send my Spirit. This is the Spirit of Christ who's present. That Spirit, which Whitehead talks about in more general terms, now becomes specific in a way that is at the heart of what I think Christians affirm. So the responses of God after Christ are the responses of a Christocentric, a Christomorphic, a Christologically formed spirit. Therefore, the response of God is distinctively mediated as the response of Christ, which is the response of the nature that Jesus revealed on earth. That's an amazing teaching. It's almost like the spotlight on history for the next 2,000 years is the spotlight of how Jesus would have experienced it. And the input to us is that Christologically, that Christomorphic response.
So here's my second question. Would you rather be labeled at your heresy trial an evolutionary Arian or an emergent adoptist?
Oh, you already know the answer to that one. The latter. In the predicament of belief, science, philosophy, and faith, Steve Knapp and I thought through the most robust notion of the resurrection we could affirm in light of the justice of God and the existence of science. And we understood that Jesus' will, being perfectly conformed to the will of God, as in Gethsemane, not my will, but thine be done, represented that complete fusion, which was the fullest meaning and infleshing of the incarnation. So Dan asks, in the process view, when did the incarnation occur? At birth, Jesus' life, at the cross, after death. And I want to say gradually over Jesus' life, we see manifested that perfect fusion. For process, I think Tripp will agree with this, it couldn't have just happened as a metaphysical given at the beginning of, say, Jesus' conception, because that would be a kind of coercion of Jesus' life given his unique metaphysical status. Set that aside, and you've got an incarnation that permeates. I should just say one thing in closing, Tripp, and that is when we had Keith Ward out to Redondo in March, it launched, and we talked about his Trinity book, it launched a correspondence between him and Steve Knapp and me about his Trinity book. And Keith thinks we don't need to do the adoptionist view because we can have a more processed Christology understood in light of the Trinitarian nature of God. So I have to say that I'm a little bit on hold about that one because Keith is influencing my own evolving thought on this question. Response.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's really helpful, and I would just think it's important for people, especially if you're new to theology, to realize the incarnation is a doctrine of the church that was developed over hundreds of years. So when the church called Jesus Christ the incarnate Son of God, the incarnate one, talked about the incarnation, it was a retroactive identification. But so the identification was not just to the birth of Jesus or the life of Jesus or the resurrection. It was an identification made in light of their continued experience of God as mediated by Jesus. So if you look at the history of Christology, the identification of Jesus' sonship shifts throughout the New Testament. In Romans, it's like the resurrection. Mark, maybe the baptism are not discussed. Matthew, Luke, birth stories, but they don't line up with different genealogies in different towns. John, all the way back to creation. John's older. There's a reason the church didn't think that it was weird that it changed. It's because those are moments where we're lapsing into doxological testimonies towards the actual presence of the living Christ in the church. So to me, sometimes we argue about like that list that Daniel gave are all in the New Testament. So we should just say only Christians decide if a homeless dead Jew was the incarnate one of God at his resurrection, his baptism, his birth, or firstborn of all creation and was slain before the foundation of the world or whatever. Like, why? Because we do thought, like, from that place. The recognition of the existential commitment one has, faith response when you start talking about incarnation is important. To me, that's a different type of theological talk than if we were then talking just about God and whether or not God's real.
Renee puts it really beautifully in the chat. She says, in the incarnation, God was able to complete what God wanted all along, that is, to dwell in, with, and among God's people. And that's exactly where I'm going, that God is luring us into the life of God in this process vision, but then God completes it, I would say, in a unique and completely fulfilled sense in this full incarnation in Jesus. And that then becomes the content of the lure and the mode of the lure in the centuries that follow.
Well, in Paul's image of eschaton, Jesus is the first fruits. So in the sense that that God was able to complete and have what God wanted to dwell in, with, and among God's people in the person of Jesus, the resurrection is an affirmation that participation in the divine life is what God intends for all creation. I mean, that I think is like, it's either like what every process theologian should do in hooking Christology and eschatology to their doctrine of God, or like the perfect reason to get called a process heretic. But why? Why should Jesus be the only one to experience what God has always desired to share with all God's creation? Because in the end, all things become subject to the Son, so that God may become all in all, sin, law, and death. And I always find that image in 1 Corinthians 15 powerful, because the identity markers of our tribalism disappear the moment you say, and God is all in all. So whatever it is that differentiates us from full participation in the divine presence, even the language we use to get there, go away. It's not like the Son to the Father so that the Father's freaking king and you better check it out. It's like that whole narrative is so that God may be all in all. So that all is identifiables identified within the life of God.
What's cool about that is it makes more sense of Colossians 1 and the cosmic Christ, because it deprovincializes the story of Jesus that we've just been talking about. Process helps in that function. I mean, we always quote Acts 1, and the message is going out to the whole world. but it's actually deeper than that in a well-understood doctrine of the incarnation. Preston writes, #son of the Theotokos. I think that there's something about the cosmic nature of what's occurred, which, by the way, is why I resist the process doctrine of creation and affirm ex nihilo. But maybe we should move on to the doctrine of the church.
I know. We got to go to the church, Phil. So,
all right, here you go.
I'll go first. All right. Hashtag. Oh,
what?
You said, I thought you wanted me to go first.
Says who?
Oh, I imagined it.
Church. Dogmatism has no place in a church that's as open to the world as God is, responding to the ever new prompting of human need and divine leading. Dogmatism has no place in a church that's as open to the world as God is, responding to the ever new prompting of human need and divine leading. And I think I can be a little briefer about this one. My experience, much of the experience of the history of the church, defined it as a place where we get the beliefs right, we set that framework of belief, and then they open the doors and you're invited in to have some bread and grape juice. That idea that we can lay out the nature of the church in some set of assumptions or assertions before we get started is contradictory to a process ecclesiology. And here, without reservation, I affirm the process view. If the point is to be open to God's openness to the world in every moment of its evolving, and our goal of being open to the lure of God in every moment of the divine leading, not my will, but thine be done. If that lies at the center, then the coming together in ecclesia has to be the coming together of folks who seek both a world openness and a God openness. And it is like, as Mark Scandrette likes to say, a Jesus dojo, a place where you go to practice the martial art of being completely open to and permeated by the Spirit of the God of Jesus Christ. That elimination of dogmatism, that complete openness to an ongoing process, which is never predictable and not even foreknown by God, that would be the heart of a process ecclesiology. In short, responding to the ever new prompting, not just of a vertical divine leading, vertically from above like lightning, but a dance, not just a dance of three Trinitarian persons, but a dance of human need, the world's need, divine leading, hurt and comfort, comfort and hurt, aloneness and togetherness, teaching others and being taught, seeking belief and allowing belief to be destructed. That is a gorgeous way to understand church.
Your line made me think of that section in Whitehead where he talks about clash of doctrines as opportunities. So can you describe as a theologian what these the battles of dogma, how they become opportunities and possibilities rather than boundaries and reasons for exclusion and harm?
Yeah. So think of somebody like Bernard of Clairvaux, who finds himself confronted with a doctrine of the atonement that is, as Tony Jones also argues, morally unacceptable, and begins to try to think, how could I think this through differently? Kierkegaard, who finds himself confronted with the entire gospel boiled down to an unfolding necessary process of a dialectic through all of history. Vatican II or Rahner, finding himself confronted with a Christocentrism that reduces all other religions to mere error and misguidedness. And that's a constructive moment. I remember it's, for me, like the moment as a young evangelical of finding myself confronted with science, and the theologians weren't, at least at my conservative world, weren't grappling with it. The philosophers weren't interested. The scientists were only hostile. And yet here was the richest request for reflection I'd ever encountered. So that would be my sense, that always we are drawn to an ongoing adventure of ideas where we're not sure of the answer. No answer has been pre-given to us in some sort of dictated response. And even God is interested in knowing what the hell we're going to come up with.
The second question, in Adventure of Ideas, Whitehead talks about the West's three great ideas. The first one being this kind of principle of limitation and possibility type stuff, Plato form style. The second one being the crucifixion of Jesus and this image of divine solidarity with suffering that can't get fit into anyone else's story. And the third is the Cappadocians' understanding of interpenetration, shared identity, social identity, and that kind of stuff. While process people may not be the world's most faithful Trinitarians, if Gregory of Nyssa was reading our term papers, what Whitehead argued is that the Trinitarian doctrine is actually the first breakthrough where you actually start to see a real relational, social, interactive vision of selves emerge. And so how can you describe that and how that gives us a framework to think about this intimacy, vulnerability, and call towards justice you described?
I love that question, Tripp. The history of theology is always torn by this pull to overcome separateness. And when you read it and teach it, you recognize that they were working with a rock that couldn't be moved. They had given themselves a problem that could not be solved with the resources, philosophical resources, that the church was using. And as that got embedded in theology, it became a crust or a scar that could not be removed because you kept building layer upon layer of difficulty on top of a foundation that was broken. By the way, I don't think that was true of the mystical traditions. It wasn't true of the traditions of Pseudo-Dionysius, the Neoplatonic tradition. It wasn't true of Eckhart. It wasn't true of Giordano Bruno. It definitely wasn't true of Nicholas of Cusa. There's this underbelly of theology, the kind that gets always rejected. The one which is the voice that has no language in post-colonial theory. And that was there always as a resource. You see it most beautifully in the medieval women mystics, I think, where the language breaks out of these limitations. So it's experienced in the way it needs to be, but it isn't actually overcome conceptually until Whitehead turns to Bradley, who wrote in the late 19th century, and Bradley channels a whole tradition that was there under the surface, like the subaltern, and finally brings it to the top. It's the tradition of internal relations. I am only related to others internally, only related through an immediacy of encounter, and not as mediated through an image on a screen, an arm that you touch. The true encounter is an immediate encounter, experience to experience. Whitehead brought that out and made that the center of his thought. He found in the Trinitarian relations a beautiful antecedent of it, even if you had a pretty low or no doctrine of the Trinity. That's a gift for us, both in understanding, primarily in understanding church. What if you were sitting and not looking at like, oh, that guy's got the rumpled tie. Oh, that's the guy that wears the t-shirt to church and forgot the deodorant. But what if we saw ourselves connected, in Christian language, soul to soul, experience to experience, at a level of immediacy that we can hardly comprehend? Tripp, tell us about your doctrine of the church.
Well, one of the ways I've, the biggest insight that understanding of process helped was even the Lord's Prayer. When we say, give us today our daily bread, and we're saying it with people who aren't actually sure they're going to eat. When you think of this process relational image of the body of Christ, those that participate in the structure of Christian existence, or whatever way you want to talk about it in process, but this shared existence life together, to say the Lord's Prayer is a call towards us who are people of privilege in a real way that's not it just doesn't linger on your consciousness when your metaphysics is a bit more solid.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna substitute one of our listeners' thesis for mine. Mine was economism is a pretty horrible world religion. Time for some Jesus-flavored heretics, and that's that. There's no better way to be postmodern and super skeptical and doubt than be a Christian who doubts the effectiveness of global capitalism, nation states, and free markets to manage justice, liberty for all. So you should be a heretic. But this one made connect way better what we were talking about. Communion, the broken body and fruitful blood of Jesus, is the ritual concrescence given over and over to the spirit of the world's body. # process this. Communion, the broken body and fruitful blood of Jesus, is the ritual concrescence given over and over to the spirit of the world's body. What do you think, Phil?
I think that's beautiful.
Because they may be excited because Sally McFay was on the podcast last week and talked about the body soul analogy thing.
Yeah, I like it. I like it that it brings together, mingles process thought and traditional Christian language. Fruitful blood is not afraid of as Sally McFay would say, that body-centered language. It doesn't accept some sort of dualism separating our lives out from from the existence of matter. The thing that we have to worry about, Tripp, is can a process thinker think the fruitful blood, or if I may, the atoning blood, without leaving process categories altogether?
I know that to me, there's been an interesting conversation in American theology around it, because Paul Tillich thought that the blood symbolism was just dead symbolism, and this is why you should get rid of it. And then James Cone responded, well, it might be at overeducated white churches in America. Maybe the blood symbolism doesn't work. Have you heard the songs of the black church in America? And then Andrew Sung Park picks up this conversation, and Andrew Sung Park's very process friendly, a Korean theologian, and he sets that conversation in not just the liveliness of the symbol for American religion, and he says, yes, the blood should sit in the churches of privilege in America as a protest in a mirror. Yes, the blood, it sits in the songs of the oppressed, knowing that God has taken sides and put skin in the game. They said that the other side of it, as a process person, he's pointing out, is that the blood in the body of Jesus is the revelatory moment that divine power is not one that covers up violence or conquers violence or suppresses violence, but the moment in which the victim violator dynamic is engaged salvifically on both sides. And if you don't experience the recognition, like the centurion, who having killed Jesus goes, surely this is the Son of God, and heard the very dying man say, your sin, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing, then as Christians of privilege, we won't have that mirror and the right type of nightmares to bring us to being. So maybe we should be squeamish and we should be uncomfortable. And what is it that we're keeping away from our consciousness if we run from the blood imagery? And in that sense, there's a dual fruitfulness to it.
I like that. So if I continue thinking in the same direction, if we really think this circle of input, accepting, output, and we incorporate that between the human and the divine, and we understand the church is the place where this dynamic consciously flows through a group of people, 2 or more gathered in his name, then the blood does take on meaning which isn't a legalistic atonement, but it is Luke 19, Leviticus 19, the life of the flesh is in the blood. It acknowledges that very life that we take in is known by God, appreciated by God, and the life is sent back to us, but also that the sin, the damage, the causing of the victim to bleed is not only something that God views with compassion, but we take back as responsibility. How am I implicated in the suffering of others? Is it really foreign to me?
One of the things I found helpful Whitehead takes language and screws with it so much just to get you to think differently. Like, part of the inventing words or using them to mean something different or just reorganizing stuff is to force you to stretch your imagination to get it. So when he takes language and things that are built around what would have been kind of set substances or places or spaces and reframes it in relational ways in which it's not that you went to some space, but you attended to this type of relation. Like, taking that, like, communion is one of the 3 places in the New Testament Jesus promises to show up. And I think if you're thinking of ecclesiology, this is helpful because Jesus promised to be at the table, right? And it's like, he didn't promise to be like at the other parts of worship services, the part where physical needs are being met and where the stories, self-giving canonic love is being established, and where he served the one that turned him over and then runs away and denies him. You can't forget the entire narrative that's being remembered. And he said to do it looking at Judas and Peter. That's like one of the most powerful parts. That's the network of relations you're showing up to, which I have at least 1 week of my years of marriage had received communion where there were standing issues between my wife and I. And when you show up in that relational dynamic, it reframes the grudges you're holding. And I'm sorry, I was wrong, will you forgive me, rolls off the tongue a little bit differently.
Yeah.
When you're imagining, this is my body, Judas, and my blood, Peter.
Nice.
And the other 2 places are the least of these promises to be there. So let's not go and treat them as this substance or something, but attend to those relationships. The 3rd place in the New Testament is Jesus promised to be in relationships of vulnerability. Like whenever 2 or 3 are gathered, or when you're confessing your sins to each other, and this type of thing. So all 3 of the places Christ promises to continue to be present are relationships where unique features are brought to the fore and you're attending to. And that, to me, helps reframe process ecclesiology. So it's less of a, let's figure out a new technology. Or let's figure out the nice new managerial style or whatever, and figure out to fix your group or fix your church or grow it or whatever. It's more of an insistence on attending to the process, the relational dynamic, the integrity of relations, and this type of thing. And that means that the style, form, and shape of your church doesn't matter much towards the actual relationship part.
Nice. So we've only got about 15 minutes of my part anyway of tonight. So I think we should get to the questions, the Jeopardy game. So where do you want, or Nathaniel, do you want the questions to be sent in on the chat or the Q&A or tweeted? Because there are going to be these statements, and then we're going to say what the process question behind them might be.
Oh, the one I just read was one of them for the game. So
so we blew it already.
Well, but I'll say the next one, Phil. So,
wait. First, just 2 more things. If people would shoot a bunch of those in, then we can play the game. So everyone should send in us a couple and try to trip us up, as it were. I want to respond briefly to Chris's question, and then if we had time, if there aren't any questions yet, I'd ask you the nerdy question of how, in Whitehead's view, there could be God leading a group rather than the individual lure. Did it disappear?
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. The question was whether panentheism only began with the incarnation, And I want to say no, from the very first creation, it was surrounded by and permeated by God, but that the content of the divine lure was able to take up Jesus' life with God, that unique moment, and presence it in every future moment of our experience with God.
Yes. So the what was the question right before that, Phil?
My nerdy question was, isn't on process, God's lure is always to the individual concrescens? How could there be a church being lured by God if you're strictly Whiteheadian?
Well, I mean, I think we have to like ask Joseph Bracken to help us understand the notion of society, and then recognize that there's all sorts of top-down causality where communities act together for a purpose that isn't any individual singular conclusion. If you what's the guy at Claremont? I saw his lecture, talks about like communal states of flow and creativity. Oh, geez.
I can't remember his name.
Anyway, so I think it's all about kind of where I've been at meetings at churches where you knew it wasn't happening, which helps you have a hermeneutic for when it does. All right.
I was looking up this guy, but I should look later.
All right.
He's got this unpronounceable Czech last name that that's like 47 characters long. So they just say the flow guy.
Yeah, well, the flow guy. All right, Phil, you have to.
There it is. Dan says Mihaly, if I'm saying it right, but it's got some extra letters in there, Dan, somewhere.
I only understood half of what he was talking about, but I liked it. So you're going to decide here, Phil, whether or not this passes the test here. God, spirit of the world, is always alienated from God's self at every moment, as being transcendent of God's immanent self. # rejection of block time.
Is this Jeopardy?
Yes.
So
that's a statement.
It's Phil, cosmic alienation for 100.
Well, if someone doesn't know what block time is, what is it? Why would a process person talk about it?
So the question behind the answer is, how do you wed the cosmic doctrine of sin with a process understanding of the flow of history? Do I get my 100, or is there a bzz there?
100, yeah, maybe 100.
Yeah, but no 300 for that one.
Yeah.
Right. So read it again, and I just have something short to say about it.
God, spirit of the world, is always alienated from God's self at every moment, as being transcendent of God's immanent self. Rejection of block time.
Yeah. This is a great question. So two things to say are, God alienated from God's self. I wouldn't want to say that about the Trinity, actually, though in some ways Orthodoxy says that when the sins of the world were heaped on Jesus on the cross, God had to, for Orthodoxy, turn, quote, his back and sacrifice his son, the blood sacrifice that allowed him again to love humanity, its sin having been taken care of. I don't affirm that as a Christian theologian, that there's disharmony in God. I see the three persons of God acting in harmony to come closer to a sinful humanity. And I see atonement in terms of that overriding love and transformation that takes away the sting, as Paul says, O death, where is thy sting? So, O sin, where is thy sting if this redemptive love and grace is so overarching and all-encompassing in this way? For the process theologian, the alienation might come between the antecedent and the consequent nature of God, the eternal nature of God and the constant responsiveness authentically to the world at every moment. But I would say that's also not an alienation, but rather two compatible parts, two compatible poles of the eternal divine nature.
All right. Here's your Jeopardy, your next Jeopardy one. Novelty and emergence, making all things new in Christ. Novelty and emergence, making all things new in Christ.
It could be, what is a process Christology? Or it could be, what would be the Heilsgeschichte of, I'm sure they meant that, the Heilsgeschichte of a process view of history. No, what's the salvation history of God's interaction in this way? What I think is fantastic is the classical doctrine of incarnation doesn't allow a place for process and emergence. Yet our experience is constantly about a becoming, a changing, being somebody we didn't know before. You'd kill me if I said this, but my 13-year-old son is just experiencing that sort of attraction to a girl that he can't name yet. What is it? You know, and if you came in and said, oh yeah, everyone's got sexual attraction, that would falsify what that 8th grade, you don't know what it is yet, but you're drawn to something. You sense this will be a new kind of experience that you haven't had before. It intrigues, it tugs, it transforms, yet you can't name it or predict it. And that seems similar to this emergent lure into a fullness of experience that God offers.
And I think it was American Alternatives, the German Idealism for 300. So you can get all 300 of your points, Phil.
I love Preston's response. Should I expand more on my thesis? It seems I failed my exam.
No one fails.
That's true. In the
clash of communication is just an opportunity for clarification.
So you got to do some Jeopardy here, but I'm not getting the question. So maybe Nathaniel should ask you, or you should ask yourself, give an answer and see if you can get 400 points for formulating the question.
Well, I only see 2 more questions.
Come on, you guys. You have to give us some more answers to find out what the process question might be.
Oh, yeah. Preston asked another question, and this one was connected to what we were talking about. Why was Jesus necessary for God to dwell with God's people? You want lapsarian? Question mark. Process this or not. Why was Jesus necessary for God to dwell with God's people? And I think process people don't think that was necessary. The odd part for process people is why Christians have actual theologians and writing theologies where anything's needed for God to dwell with God's people. That seems to be like God's best hobby, is creating gardens, putting people in it, and hanging out. And then it didn't work out as well, but God hadn't stopped hanging out.
By the way, Dan gave us the name of the flux sky at Claremont. It's an unpronounceable Czech word with so many KSZWs and things that nobody could pronounce it, but we could massacre it because it looks like 6 cents. So, or either the movie or 6 pennies. So we're going to call them 6 cents Mahali. Just let's hope he never sees this.
All right. James Kelly said, just as the parent must respond differently to the adolescent or adult than the child, so must God to an evolving world.
Why is it impossible to conceive the Christian God in static terms? You try one. See if you can get a question.
All right. Well, hold on. Now I have to look at it again. Just as the parent must respond differently to the adolescent, so God must to an evolving world. Because God's not a jerk. Or why is God not a jerk? Like it's
Preston, you got 0 points.
In God in the World, is where Cobb gives my favorite response to people that are really down for omnipotence, where he goes, well, what a very unsuccessful parent if you have to by force make your child go to school. Successful parents teach them to value their friends, respect their teachers, and enjoy education. And if God could intervene and fix everything, then I would never let God babysit, because way too many children have been hit by cars.
Okay, here's an answer from Dan. Give us the question. The only thing wrong with process theology is that it's such an attractive alternative to Christian faith.
Oh. What is Roger Olson's rhetorical flourish that does not have sustainability upon critical reflection?
John Cobb, here's one. Cobb, Griffin, and Suhaki stand in three radically different traditions and can't be seen as representatives of a single approach, a single theology. Question.
Yeah. Let's see, that just required everyone to have read multiple books. So we'll end, Phil, by answering this, because
no, here's the question is, why is it false to speak of the Claremont School of Process Theology?
Oh, I didn't even see that one.
I just made that up.
Oh.
I've got three more I'll make up if you're not working hard enough. But anyway, you want to go someplace else?
No, because we're going to end on time. You have 4 minutes, and we're going to end on time. So if people want more, then they can come next time. And
it's only because I'm on Roger Olson's podcast at 8.
Okay.
Time, which is why process theology is heresy.
Well, when you get on that podcast, could you explain, like why doesn't his critique have sustainability? Is what Dan wants to know. Because Roger said the only thing wrong with process is it's an attractive alternative to Christian faith.
Because time and eternity can't ultimately be separated. What's the question?
But now you have to say more, because you have 3 minutes, and he really wants to know. Because, I mean, to me, the biggest problem when people essentialize Christianity and then tell people they aren't in it is, it was tried, and they had to call the Council of Jerusalem and tell Peter he was wrong and that Gentiles didn't have to get snipped. So there's a certain level of presumptuousness to then say something's an alternative to Christianity, because most of the alternatives to Christianity later became normative and then became conservative. And if you could have said the same thing to Huss, and then they burned him, and then Luther was edgy, and then now it's like the 500th anniversary next year, and people are going to be getting there like, so, yeah, this justification by faith thing, that's kind of, that's conservative, boring, blah, blah, blah. And at some point, the same type of ideas were different. So, anyway,
as a conclusion, I think and then I should give you the last word. I want to respond to what Dan wrote. Let me read it again. The only thing wrong with process theology is that it's such an attractive alternative to Christian faith. My closing answer to the question, why as a Christian theologian am I a process thinker, would be that finding of attractive ideas, powerful ideas, which aren't just biblical verses, is for me the deepest understanding of Christian faith. I used to be afraid of science because it might attack my belief in miracles. I used to be afraid of other religions because it made it harder for me to talk about the uniqueness of Christ. I used to be afraid of the philosophies of man, as it was called, because they would undercut the gospel. As a process theologian, I'm excited about each alternative system that I encounter, and the more powerful, the more explanatory, the more subtle, intriguing it is, the more I'm drawn to it. Not out of fear that my Christianity will go up in smoke and flames, beaten by a better alternative, but because the understanding of Christianity is itself a continually evolving reality that gets bigger the more you live into it. What was that closing phrase from the end of Narnia in the 7th volume? Further up and further in as they climb the mountains. I think that to encounter alternatives that blow our best theologies out of the water is the heart of what the Christian quest is all about. Not that it's a different spirit, not that it's a different gospel or a different Christ, but that the meaning of an infinite event can never be captured by any particular formulation. And the only theological framework I know that makes that central to what it says is process. It's always open, it's always changing, and God is always more than you ever could have asked or imagined.
Yes. So now it just appears that there needs to be a debacle between you and Roger to settle all this out. And I'm sure it'll be entertaining and fun. But until then, people just have to read 3,000 word blog posts. Because, you know, what's a medium for?
Tripp, what's your closing?
Oh, my closing thing is just to say this was a lot of fun. And thank you, everyone, for joining in. And you'll get a little email with like where you can get the replay, or if you're watching the replay now because you weren't joining us live, now you've just seen it. But also we'll have a little click through thing where you can do a little survey and give input and such for future things like this. And if you're interested in joining the regular reading group, you can have a link to that. And because we're going to be picking stuff for coming up in the next year. I also just got confirmation that we got a brewery on Saturday night of AAR, and Elizabeth Johnson's going to do the live podcast in downtown San Antonio. Sweet. So it's the first announcement of it. So Saturday night in San Antonio, if you're a nerd professionally or live in San Antonio, Elizabeth A. Johnson is going to be doing the podcast. There'll be plenty of other stuff to happen at it as well. But we got our brewery, and we're going to have fun. So what better thing to do than read She Who Is, and just to get in preparation for it. So that's going to be exciting.
Sweet. Hey, thanks for the discussion, Tripp. It was a lot of fun. And thanks to everyone for the questions and prodding us in that way.
Oh, and how's John doing? I got a text that said, is there an update on how's John doing? If they took my class online during the process week, they know that you subbed because John fell. Yeah. But
so it was absolutely amazing. That was a Friday. He fell down, then on a pavement, tripped over a sidewalk or something. They picked him up, but because he just hit his head on the ground, he passed out again and fell again. So they took him to the hospital, observed him, let him out 3 hours later, and the whole time he's saying, I don't need to go to the hospital. They're going, well, you're bleeding. No, I'm fine. So he got out that afternoon, and the next day we began 10 hours of interviews that ran through Saturday and Sunday, and he was completely present, calm, his face is all bruised up, and now all the bruises are gone, and he's leading 6-hour retreats at 93 or something, 92.
Yeah, well, there you go. See, who would have thought? Process theology, health, perk. You can prehend that.
Also, he's not supposed to be eternal. Only God is eternal. Well, maybe.
But he's objectively immortal, and that's all you need. After
all right, I got to go do the Roger Olson.
All right, well, you tell Roger hi.
All right.
Bye,
Thanks
Phil.
for joining me. Bye.